Released in 2016, Shin Godzilla is the 29th Japanese Godzilla film, the first Toho-produced Godzilla movie since 2004, and the beginning of the fourth era of Godzilla films. The previous Godzilla series ended prematurely due to consistently declining ticket sales, which ultimately forced Toho to put the franchise in hibernation once again, but not before celebrating his 50th anniversary by going all out in Godzilla Final Wars. With a full 12 years separating Final Wars and Shin, it was the longest break the franchise has ever taken. Following the success of the 2014 American Godzilla film, Toho decided to make a film that harkens back to the franchise's roots, a standalone film more in the vein of the original 1954 Gojira, where Godzilla is an unstoppable threat to Japan and mankind at large. They made the inspired choice of approaching Hideaki Anno, most known for creating the highly popular and influential anime Neon Genesis Evangelion, to both write and direct. Anno is notorious for bringing his unique and personal storytelling style to everything he is involved with, so his hiring drew much interest and anticipation from the fanbase, who were eager to see what he would do with Godzilla. Directing alongside Anno was Shinji Higuchi, Anno's longtime friend and the director of the two recent live-action Attack on Titan films. While Anno would serve as chief director, Higuchi was in charge of directing and coordinating the special effects-heavy sequences involving Godzilla, which, for the first time, is brought to life with computer-generated effects instead of the traditional suitmation techniques. Together, their intention was to make the scariest, largest, and most imposing Godzilla ever put on screen. Shin Godzilla opened in Japan on July 29, 2016, and it was an enormous critical and financial success. Japanese audiences loved it, and it stayed in the top 10 until late September, closing out at an equivalent of $77 million, making it the highest-grossing Godzilla film ever made, an all the more impressive feat when you remember how old this franchise is. Shin Godzilla even swept the Japanese Academy Awards, taking home both Best Director and Best Picture, as well as all the technical categories. It was an incredible validation for one of Japan's most famous icons, and for the first time since perhaps the original, Japan was immensely proud of a Godzilla film. Now, to anyone only familiar with Godzilla in the context of the cheesy B-movies that make up the majority of the films, all of this admiration probably seems rather strange. A Godzilla movie winning Best Picture? What are the Japanese smoking? It's just a silly monster movie. It's not meant to be taken seriously, right? Well, not quite. While Shin Godzilla certainly isn't a perfect film, when you take into consideration all of its working parts, along with the history of Godzilla and Japan's relationship with what he represents, it's easy to see why Shin Godzilla is loved by his home country. And that's why I'm here, my friends, to show you why, regardless of whether you love it or hate it, this film is worthy of admiration for the simple fact that it aspires to be something beyond just another Godzilla movie, and in doing so becomes one of the most resonant entries of the franchise, exhibiting accomplished filmmaking in nearly every category, including writing, acting, shot composition, music, special effects, and theme. Shin Godzilla is one of the most unique and interesting entries to come out of this franchise in a very long time, and I think it's because somehow, someway, it manages to be as radically different as it is faithfully traditional. In both concept and structure, Shin Godzilla is very much a remake of the original 1954 film, or as close to one as any film has ever gotten. Like that film, it is about the emergence of an immortal radioactive monster that wreaks havoc on Japan, and the attempts of the human characters to stop it. But Shin takes that concept and plants it in a current modern day context, and just like how the original explored and reflected the fears and tensions of its time regarding war and atomic power, Shin Godzilla explores and reflects the current fears and anxieties Japan has regarding nuclear and natural disasters, government incompetency, and its place in global politics, specifically scrutinizing the nation's submissive relationship with the United States. And just like how the original was influenced by the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Shin Godzilla draws direct inspiration from the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, the resulting tsunami, and the Fukushima nuclear disaster, which is one of the most crippling and deadly natural disasters that have hit Japan in recent memory, and one in which the nation is still dealing with today. Just as the original had images of destruction eerily similar to those of the bombings, Shin Godzilla very deliberately recalls the images seen during the 2011 earthquake in its scenes of destruction. When the first form of Godzilla crawls ashore and begins slowly trudging across the landscape, wiping everything away in his path, it blatantly mirrors images of the tsunami and the resulting flooding. And when Godzilla unleashes the full power of his atomic breath later in the film, the area is contaminated with radiation, similar to that of the Fukushima power plant meltdown. But the film dives much deeper into this issue from the human side of things by framing the story through the point of view of the government and its politicians, and uses this point of view to critique and parody the Japanese government, whom many believe weren't adequately prepared and demonstrated an inability to properly respond to environmental disasters. This makes Shin Godzilla the most political film in the series. Every character is a political figure, and everyone, big and small, has a logistical role to play in the story, which the film makes sure you never forget by obnoxiously plastering the names of every character and location on screen. This, along with the sheer size of the cast, is one of the most common criticisms made about Shin Godzilla. The film overburdens the viewer with countless characters big and small, job descriptions to keep track of, and locations to remember. This is especially burdensome for foreign viewers, who on top of all that also have subtitles to read. The film essentially overloads you with information and people to follow, which makes it almost impossible to read it all on first viewing. The viewer is meant to be overburdened with endless titles and descriptions, which helps put you in the state of mind of the characters who have to deal with this day in and day out. It all serves the film's purpose of satirizing government bureaucracy and showing how it inhibits immediate reaction to surprise disasters. Thankfully, however, Shin Godzilla never veers off into outright condemnation or vilification. While the process is shown to be comically flawed, the people involved are all depicted as trying to do their very best given the situation. Prime Minister Higuchi is the perfect example of this. While shown as being way in over his head, he isn't completely incompetent. Even while overwhelmed by an unprecedented scenario, you always believe that he's doing what he thinks is best for his people. When Godzilla is heading towards their direction, he insists on staying to oversee the US's bombing operation and has to be convinced by his aides to evacuate for the good of the nation. He is honorable and prioritizes the safety of the citizens, but also open to the opinions and suggestions of those around him, most likely because he wouldn't know what to do without them. It would have been very easy to depict the Prime Minister as either a complete bumbling oaf or a self-interested jerk, but Anno wisely avoids that for a more nuanced, relatable approach, and he implements this approach in every aspect of the screenplay. A lesser script would have had some human antagonists working on the fringes to undermine the hero, but there's none of that here. All of the characters are sympathetic and working for the good of Japan. It's just that the traditional ways of doing things outdates their thinking. The movie makes the case that it's not necessarily the people that's the problem, but the bureaucracy that cages them in and slows the government's response. So then, what's the solution to this problem? Unsurprisingly, Anno suggests that it's the freaks, nerds, outcasts, and rule breakers on the fringes that are the key to cutting through the red tape and getting things done. With Japan on the ropes, they are called on to put their talents to use in an open forum of collaboration and cooperation. No endless cabinet meetings, no chain of command to filter through, just pure action. This group of misfit scientists are ultimately the ones who come up with the final plan of injecting Godzilla with coagulant to freeze him, which ends up working. In the end, it's teamwork and scientific thinking that saves the day. It's a positive and well-meaning message that keeps Shin Godzilla from being cynical despite its target for criticism. Another distinct aspect of Shin Godzilla is how cleverly funny it is. Anno's greatest tool in satirizing the government is humor, which is used to point out the failures of Japanese bureaucracy. There are numerous visual gags involving cabinet meetings where characters end one meeting just to move to another room for another meeting. Many of the characters don't know what they're talking about or what's going on, making assumptions only to be contradicted. One of the best gags early in the film is when the Prime Minister publicly assures citizens that Godzilla won't make landfall, and then it cuts to Godzilla making landfall and people running for their lives. This gag also wonderfully demonstrates how the film is able to balance its humorous moments with the horrific nature of the situation. Shin Godzilla may be very funny when it wants to be, but it's also able to be haunting and disturbing when it wants to be. Godzilla's first rampage, with persecution of the masses playing in the background, is positively spine-chilling, a feeling enhanced by the bizarre design of its first form, an embryonic eel-like looking creature that's just as goofy looking as it is unnerving with how it never blinks and only stares off into the void with no conscience. Admit it, it would be terrifying seeing this thing loom over you in the distance as it crushes you and everything in its path. How Anno is able to balance these two shifting tones so perfectly is part of what makes Shin Godzilla such a great film. One moment you'll be enjoying an amusing character interaction or situation, the next you'll be thrilled and intimidated by the incredibly well done Godzilla sequences. Speaking of which, Shin Godzilla contains some of the most breathtaking Godzilla moments ever put on film. Gone are the days of men in rubber suits stomping on models and toy tanks, which, as much as I love those, always gave even the best films a cheesiness that, while appealing to folks like me who love it, often turned off those less familiar with it. This isn't the case with Shin Godzilla. The special effects are leagues better than any previous film in every category. For the first time, Godzilla is brought to life with CGI, which should have been terrible considering how bad past usages of it were, but here it looks fantastic, even flawless in certain shots. This is of course helped by the fact that Godzilla never moves beyond a snail's pace, which no doubt makes rendering easier, but it has the added benefit of feeling like old school man in a suit without actually doing so. However, the film thankfully continues the use of miniature effects, so it's not all computer graphics. Instead, the two effects techniques are used together to bring Godzilla and the destructive elements to life in a more believable way than ever before. By far the most impressive sequence is no doubt when Godzilla unleashes his atomic breath for the first time. It is a visual powerhouse depicting a level of destruction rarely seen in any film. It feels authentic authentic, which gives the sequence real emotional weight and impact, enhanced by a phenomenal score by Shiru Sugisu, who has also worked with Anno on Neon Genesis Evangelion. The believability factor is heightened by how genuine everything feels. Shin Godzilla paints an extremely realistic portrait of a nation's response to Godzilla. Much of the running time is made up of mass evacuations, press conferences, military briefings, and political meetings. And for perhaps the first time, we get what at least feels like the most realistic military engagement with Godzilla ever depicted. While most previous films had endless amounts of tanks and planes throwing themselves at Godzilla for our amusement, here there's an actual strategy, a hierarchical attack formation where, when one wave isn't working, it pulls back to make way for the next wave. It is logical, and that goes a long way towards making the story feel genuinely dramatic, which in turn makes Godzilla feel like a true threat that can't be stopped. And man, is Godzilla a force to be reckoned with in this film. This is the most threatening Godzilla since the original, a pure apathetic destroyer. Obviously, the most immediately striking thing about this Godzilla is his design, which, aside from the 98 American design, is as far from the traditional look of the character there's ever been. With his misshapen teeth, blank dead eyes, tiny useless little arms, and almost comically long tail, this Godzilla is twisted and malformed, a grotesque monstrosity that bleeds and drips everywhere. He essentially looks like a gigantic walking tumor, which keeps the idea that he was created by radiation fresh in your mind when you look at him. But as different as this design is, it's also unmistakably Godzilla. You can see that this Godzilla draws inspiration from the original 1954 design, particularly in the face, which contains the same small beady eyes that the original had. It's a nice blend of Anno's uniquely outlandish design quirks with the classic Godzilla design, and is in many ways an encapsulation of how the film is as different as it is traditional. The alterations also extend to Godzilla's abilities. His atomic breath is not merely a contained singular beam, but an explosive massive fireball that shrinks into a precise purple laser that can slice through buildings like butter. And no longer does it just come out of his mouth, now it's able to be fired out of his back and tail. It's beautiful and devastating and unlike anything we've ever seen Godzilla do before. And that's what makes Shin Godzilla especially noteworthy, the fact that it's able to show us new things in a franchise that's over 60 years old. Some purists don't like that this Godzilla is so different from past incarnations, which is understandable, but this film took some creative risks, and I think that's what makes it special. We've seen Godzilla do the same things over and over again, and Toho should be commended for taking a chance and allowing an artist like Hideaki Anno to put his own spin on the character. And besides, for as much liberties as Anno took, he also went out of his way to honor everything that came before, almost to a fault. There is so much love for Godzilla and the history of the franchise in this one movie, and you can feel it right from the opening titles, which directly recalls the effectively simplistic opening of the original. The film implements a slavish use of old school sound effects, including the original 1954 roar, as well as some of the most memorable Akira Ifukube tracks, which is bound to make every Godzilla fan crack a smile. Anno didn't have to use these tracks, but he did because he clearly respects Godzilla and what he represents. And for as weird as this film gets, you never forget that as you're watching it. As good as those classic Ifukube tracks are though, Shiru Sugisu's new score is just as good. It complements and emphasizes the themes and sense of awe and dread, and the use of vocals gives a mythical quality to Godzilla, which, if you listen closely to, tells a story of its own. The use of decisive battle from Evangelion during the meeting scenes between our heroic misfit scientists gives all the scientific jargon being spouted a rapid-fire intensity that's really fun to watch, and a treat for Evangelion fans. The pacing of Shin Godzilla is also relentlessly fast, which works to the film's advantage with the story it's telling. It may overwhelm a first-time viewer, but the richness and density of the storytelling and pacing rewards multiple viewings. You begin to recognize and notice things you might have missed the last time, which is very easy to do because there are so many characters and so much going on. It's just so entertaining. There's just something about the way the film is cut and presented that makes it highly engaging. However, the quick pace and large ensemble cast means that there is no time for real character development, and this lack of depth is one of the most common critiques of Shin Godzilla, and one which I don't think is fair. The film isn't trying to present complex characters. The nature of the story, which is intense and time-sensitive, doesn't allow for downtime in which the characters can explain their backstory or call their families. Every moment is a race to stop Godzilla and save Japan and its citizens. This scenario is where the drama comes from. It's all about the big picture story, seeing how a government reacts and attempts to deal with this indestructible creature. And to emphasize this, the film features a huge sprawling cast of characters of varying degrees of participation. Most of them merely stand around and fulfill their job description, but there are a handful of them that stand out and majorly contribute to the plot. Even if you don't remember most of the characters' names, their personality quirks leave an impression, and the actors give solid performances all around. The closest thing we do get to a main character though is Rando Yaguchi, played by Hiroki Hasegawa. He is the first one to go against the common consensus, to which everyone writes him off. But he is quickly proven right, and from that point he leads the charge to save Japan. There's actually a great gag where Higuchi's list of titles grows longer the longer the film goes on as he takes on more responsibility. He's basically the ideal politician, as driven as he is humble, pragmatic, but also idealistic. Higuchi is a simple, highly motivated character, and while that means he isn't exactly complex, his character works well as the hero of the story. He isn't bogged down with crippling self-doubt like Shinji from Evangelion. His job gives him purpose. Another major character is Kyoko Ann Patterson, played by Satomi Ishihara, and if there's one major blemish with Shin Godzilla, it's her character. Not because she is a bad actress, but because her character is supposed to be a Japanese-American citizen, but it's clear when she speaks English that it isn't her native language. This makes it almost laughable when the film would have the viewer believe that she is the ambitious daughter of an American politician whose life goal is to be President of the United States by age 40. This character just doesn't come off as realistic, which clashes with the rest of the film, which is very grounded and believable. That being said, she spends most of the film speaking Japanese, so this is a very minor quibble. But despite the faults in the execution, Kyoko Ann Patterson serves an integral function of the story, and that is to represent the alliance between Japan and the United States. Her character is a bridge between the two nations, which is important because more than anything else, Shin Godzilla is a film about Japan's place on the world stage. Unlike most prior Godzilla films, the story here does not exist in a vacuum, where Japan has to deal with Godzilla on their own. Godzilla's appearance is a world-changing event that other nations have to consider, and we see this play out from Japan's perspective. The film specifically considers the relationship between Japan and the United States, the former of which has been living under the paternalistic thumb of the latter since the end of the Second World War. This relationship is presented consistently throughout the film, with Japan constantly in negotiations with the US and calling on their military aid when their own efforts fail. When even the US fails to kill Godzilla with B-2 bombers, the United Nations takes control of the situation, with the US insisting that an atomic bomb is the only way to kill Godzilla for good. Thus we get the moral dilemma of the third act. For the first time since 1945, another A-bomb will be dropped on Japanese soil. This is a worst-case nightmare for Japan, who are basically being forced to let this happen. The film wisely lets this dilemma breathe for a while as we get to see the characters contemplate what this means, and it's all subtly done, well acted and directed. These moments definitely give the third act a much slower pace than the rest of the film, which is seen as a negative by some, but it's these moments that make Shin Godzilla a truly great film that goes beyond its genre. Even though it's addressing modern day fears and disasters, the film still maintains an emotional and thematic connection to the horrific events that inspired Ishiro Honda's classic. It treats the idea of using nuclear weapons on Japan with proper reverence and makes you feel the weight of that decision. The tension of the finale then comes not just from stopping Godzilla, but doing so before the bomb is dropped on Tokyo, a successful effort thanks to Higuchi and his gang of misfits. They figure out a way to stop him through hard work, clever planning, and out-of-the-box thinking. Japan is able to save themselves instead of relying on the military might of others, demonstrating that it has the power and spirit to be their own nation. This final point shows that, for as critical as Anno's story is of the government, it's not anti-government. If anything, Shin Godzilla is extremely patriotic to its homeland. It contains a very nationalistic message, but in a nuanced way without being jingoistic. And while the film doesn't always present the US in the most positive light, it's not anti-American. It acknowledges the value of that relationship, both good and bad, which feels true and honest. The film ends on a different but equally compelling note as the original. While Gojira's ending was very somber and full of dread for the future, Shin Godzilla's ending is positive but cautionary, with Higuchi stating that they must learn to live with Godzilla, in a sense saying that as deadly as nuclear power can be, it's a part of our lives now, and we have to live with it and manage it instead of running away in fear. Then there is of course the final image, a visually stunning and disturbing shot of what looks like half-human, half-Godzilla-like creatures embedded in Godzilla's tail, reaching out in agony. This ending shot leaves you with a lot of questions, which is exactly what Hideaki Anno wants, and there are a lot of theories about what this means. Personally, I like to leave it ambiguous just because I think that makes the ending more haunting. For me, it works on a more metaphorical and thematic level, and overthinking it kind of takes away from its impact. Like a lot of Anno's work, it's up to each individual to interpret it in their own subjective way. It's a perfect final statement to an incredibly effective movie. So in conclusion, I think Shin Godzilla is a wonderful creative achievement that respects both the central idea behind Godzilla and the history of the franchise. Hideaki Anno is clearly a fan of Godzilla and understands how to adapt the original story for modern times, but at the same time he takes some personal creative liberties to keep it fresh, and in doing so makes a Godzilla movie that's as different as it is familiar. With this in mind, it's absolutely no surprise that Shin Godzilla won big at the Japanese Academy Awards. This is a film that Japan is proud of, and they have every right to be. Shin Godzilla was first and foremost made for them. It is entertainment that encourages dialogue and provides catharsis for the citizens of Japan to come to terms with one of the greatest natural tragedies of our time, the kinds of tragedies that the nation is all too familiar with, and it does so in a very sophisticated way that you don't see in most Godzilla movies. In my opinion, Shin Godzilla is the best Godzilla movie since the original, one of the best kaiju movies ever made, and perhaps best of all, a genuinely good film period. It reminds you why Godzilla is the ultimate movie monster, because when someone with a vision and something to say really tries to make not just a fun and entertaining Godzilla movie, but a compelling film in its own right, you're reminded of why Godzilla is still as relevant today as he was 60 years ago.